Hi, Kristen Atchison here, and this is our second lecture talking about early capacities in infancy. And we're going to focus on sensation and perception, both prenatally and after birth. So prenatally, infants actually have a lot of capabilities when they're still a fetus. So this sensory functioning really begins before they're born. And we're going to talk just a little bit here about the different capabilities and when they kind of come online. And then we'll talk about some detailed research as how we know that they really have these senses and that they can form memories about them. So vision is a very immature sense at birth, but we do see fetuses start to respond to external light at about 22 weeks. So we've got some very, very immature visual functioning happening in your utero. It's going to be one of the least developed senses because it has the least input while we're in the fetal stage before birth. We see perception of pain or other stimulus around about 30 weeks. Again, that's going to be more related to those touch or those the nociception, the pain. We'll see olfaction and gustation, which is smell and taste. We can tell this by premature babies that are born about 28 weeks that can detect mint and floral odors. We also know that infants begin to swallow amniotic fluid, and that's the fluid that they're surrounded with in utero about 11 weeks. So we're talking about in the embryonic stage here that this swallowing starts. And we'll talk about how that's really going to affect that development, and that's going to affect kind of the preferences that they have. And audition is really fully functional by the end of the 6 months in utero. So this is going to be the most developed of the senses, and we'll talk about a lot of different research that really supports this and what the infants and the embryos and the fetuses can do with that information. So let's first talk about olfaction. So this was a study done in 1998. And what they did was they took newborn babies that were 2 days old and 4 days old. And they gave them a choice of things to smell. Okay, so they could choose to smell the amniotic fluid from their mother. So when they were born, samples were taken of that amniotic fluid, or they could choose to smell formula. Now these were all formula-fed infants. So this is something that they're going to have had some experience with, 2 to 4 days worth. It's going to have good memories too because it tastes good and your bellies are full, these kinds of things. And what we see is that both 2 days and 4 days, infants are preferring to smell that amniotic fluid as opposed to that formula milk. So both of these they've had experience with, but they've had a lot more experience with that amniotic fluid, with the smell and taste of that amniotic fluid, and we see a preference for that. They are turning their heads towards the smell that they want to hear. And what this really tells us is that there is evidence for learning and memory from this prenatal sensation. So they're getting this prenatal sensation of taste and smell, and both of those are chemical senses. And after birth, they're preferring that smell over something else that's positive that they've had more limited experience with. So this is telling us that infants are both learning what their mother's amniotic fluid smells like and remembering it after birth. So they haven't smelled this in 2 to 4 days, and they're still remembering that and orienting their head to that. So again, this is evidence of that prenatal learning and memory, and also evidence of what that sensation and perception is going on prenatally. So audition, again, we said that this is going to be the most developed of the prenatal senses. We know this, that infants respond both to internal and external sounds, and they can hear both of those. So they hear the things that are happening outside of mom's body, so loud music, people talking, these sorts of things, but they're also getting internal sounds as well. So the sounds of mom's different bodily functions, heartbeat, things like that. We're also going to be hearing mom's voice both externally and internally. And so we're going to have a really good set of experiences with mom's voice. So we're getting both this internal and external sound to the infant before they're even born, to that fetus before they're even born. So the fetal auditory system is, again, functional by the end of the 6-month prenatal. So that gives us 3 whole months, essentially, prenatally, that this fetus is able to experience these sounds and have access to this kind of auditory information, this auditory sensation and perception before they're even born. Ways that we know that this is happening is we'll see motor responses. So fetuses will startle to loud noises. So if you have ever been around a pregnant woman and there's a really loud noise, that baby can startle, and mom will notice that. There'll be a big motion change. We'll also see habituation to sound. So again, we've already talked about habituation in that attention piece in our lecture in class, but infants get used to a sound, and they'll stop that kind of motor response. And we also see inhibition of activities. Think about it. When you're really trying to listen to something, you get really still. And fetuses do the same thing. And again, this is indication that they really have this fully functioning auditory system. We also get this from cardiac models. So we can measure fetal heart rate, and we can see that there can be accelerative changes in heart rate when they're really, really interested in something, or we can see changes in variability as a response to this auditory stimulation. So both of these really indicate that infants, again, have this auditory sensation and perception online well before they're even born. Other ways that we know this is we can actually record what happens inside the uterus. So we know that vocal frequencies, so sounds from our voice that are above 1,000 hertz can be recorded. And we see this in both human and sheep studies. So sheeps actually have a very, very similar kind of body mass and uterus. So it's you can put a microphone in a sheep uterus. A lot more sheep will agree to that than humans. But we've done it with both human and sheep studies, and we find those same things. The other things that they do is they can take recordings from these vocal sounds that they hear externally. So a recording device would be inside either the human or the sheep, and they can record the way that sounds. And then they play those recordings to adults. And what adults notice about these is they can tell the frequency contours. So the changes in the pitch in how we speak, which when we get to language will be very, very important for infants. How we speak, those frequency contours, kind of the melody in which we speak is very important to infants, very salient. We can get temporal information. So how fast the voice is, how slow the voice is. We can get rhythmic information. And again, we'll have information to some extent about pitch as well. So again, all of these things are accessible to this fetus while they're developing in utero. Other ways that we know that infants really have access to audition is what studies have done is they'll expose fetuses prenatally to language. So basically it's like playing a microphone to mom's tummy. And they'll do it either a recording, they'll do it mom speaking, they'll do it a number of different ways. And what they find is that when infants are born, they'll hook baby up with headphones like this and a little suck measure there, and infants will preferentially suck to hear the sounds that they're most familiar with, to hear the sounds that they're interested in hearing. And what we find is newborns prefer to listen to their mother's voice. They will change their sucking pattern when mom's voice is being played versus when another mother's voice is being played. So again, this is telling us that infants are experiencing their mother's voice prenatally, learning their mother's voice prenatally, and have a memory for their mother's voice prenatally. There's also been studies that have been done that's looked at not only mom's voice, but preferences for specific stories or specific songs. So in this DeCasper and Spence study, it's often called the Cat in the Hat study because mom read the Cat in the Hat while she was pregnant repeatedly. And then infants were tested after they were born. at both mom reading The Cat in the Hat, an unfamiliar woman reading The Cat in the Hat, mom reading a different story, and the unfamiliar mom reading a different story. And what they found is that mom reading The Cat in the Hat, so the voice that they were used to and the story that they were used to, really showed the highest preference. They preferentially sucked for this. Again, this is really evidence for that learning and memory. This DeCasper and Spence study is one of the studies that you can choose to read for this week's online participation. Other examples of this prenatal audition, this prenatal exposure to language, comes from studies of languages. So infants at birth are actually doing the same thing, this suck paradigm, preferring to listen to their native language over a non-native language. So whatever mom was speaking while mom was pregnant, they're preferring that language to another language. So infants are beginning to learn the language that's in their environment before they're even born. Not only that, but when you take out the actual words, you take out the actual kind of things that the vocabulary that distinguishes one language from another, and you just leave the prosody, that melody, those frequency contours in which we speak, infants prefer the prosody from their native language versus a non-native language. So think about the way different languages sound, right? English sounds very different than German, and it sounds very different than Italian. They have these different kinds of prosody to them, these different kind of melodies in which we speak. And again, infants are preferring that native prosody over non-native prosody. Again, this is evidence for learning and memory. Infants are hearing that language prenatally, their native language prenatally. They're learning that language prenatally, and they're remembering that language after they're born. So this is, again, evidence that not only is the audition system fully online, but it's really starting to work in the effort for infants to learn language before they're even born. Okay, so what other sensory information do babies detect? Taste, so that would be that gustation. Newborns discriminate salt, sour, bitter, and sweet at birth. So again, they have the ability to kind of start to use that sensation and perceptions to tell things apart. We can tell this by facial expressions for these different things. We can tell that babies actually prefer sweet tastes. If you've ever tasted breast milk or formula, they are very, very sweet. And there's one of the reasons that infants are preferring this sweet taste is because of that. Fetuses, again, start to swallow that amniotic fluid very, very early when they're embryos, and about 11 weeks. And the way amniotic fluid is it changes based on what mom eats. So if mom eats very, different cuisines have different flavors, and those are passed on. So garlic kinds of flavors, these really, really strong flavors are passed on to this amniotic fluid. And so it changes based on what mom is eating. That allows infants to start to have the ability to discriminate between these tastes very, very early before they're even born. So it's no surprise that infants can do this at birth when they have this really huge amount of experience with different tastes. We see the same kinds of things with smell. Infants can discriminate licorice, vanilla, vinegar, alcohol, these sorts of things. We know this by both those different facial expressions, those head turn kinds of behaviors. Again, we talked about how infants recognize and prefer the odor of amniotic fluid. And after 6 days, they actually prefer and recognize mom's odor as well. So the way that mom smells differently than someone else. And we're not talking about perfume. We're not talking about they recognize mom's, wearing Chanel No. 5. We're talking that they recognize mom's just natural smell. And so again, this is really evidence that how these systems are really online and ready to go when the infant's born. So they can hear really well, they can taste really well, they can smell really well, but as we talked about, they can't see very well. And that's because they've had not near as much experience with taste and with vision as they have with taste and smell and sounds. So again, the vision of a newborn is really, really bad. Part of that is because they don't know how to use their lens. They don't know how to focus their eye. They don't know how to kind of what we call accommodation, focus that lens. So this kind of big, kind of bulbous, like oval thing there, that's the lens. And we don't see kind of a more adult-like ability to accommodate till about 3 months. So newborn infants have really, really poor focus. They have a poor ability to focus on something, and that really results in very, very fuzzy images. Newborn infants can see best at about the distance from the face to the breast. That's about where they can see the best. It's still fuzzy. It's still hard to see. If you ever look at babies and they look really cross-eyed, it's not because that baby's going to be cross-eyed. It's because that newborn can't focus its eyes yet. And it's really struggling with that. And so that's going to really, learning how to use those muscles, those ciliary muscles and those zonal fibers to adjust that lens takes practice. It's exercise, right? And so it's not till about 3 months that we see that's adult-like. So they can't focus that lens, and that's really going to affect their ability to see. The other problem that they have is that the fovea, the center of the retina, where we focus, when we focus on something, when you look at this video, if you're looking at the word fovea, then you have put the word fovea on your fovea. You have focused on that. And that's a really poorly developed area at birth, and it takes a while for it to get there. The other thing is that the visual cortex, where that information is processed, is really immature as well. Both of which are functions of the fact that there hasn't been a lot of visual input in utero. It's dark in there. Everything's really close. So there's not really that same kind of ability to work those muscles and to develop that system before the infant's born. So again, we've got really bad visual acuity at birth. They cannot see well. And it's not till about 6 months that infants really start to see at what approximates an adult's vision. So it takes about 6 months of practice and to get those muscles working, to get the systems developed like the fovea, and to really get the brain developed to take in that information. And we also see really limited color vision till about 4 months. So there's been trends to do these really, black and white kind of nurseries and these high contrast items for newborns. They're doing that because infants can't really see color very well. And those high contrast colors, they can kind of tell the difference between a white and a black better than they can a light blue versus a light pink. Those are going to look very, very similar to an infant. So again, we don't really see this kind of color vision really until about 4 months. Part of that is because of this underdeveloped fovea. The fovea has all of our cones on it, which are processing color. If your fovea is not ready to go, if it's not working fully, then it's not going to be able to process those color information fully. So again, those are both the acuity and the color vision really go back to this poorly developed fovea at birth. So again, they're preferring these high contrast edges because they can see the difference, whereas they can't necessarily see the difference between the light pink and the light blue and the light green and the light yellow. Those all look very, very similar to them, if not the same. So how do we know what infants can actually see? How do we measure this acuity? One of the ways we do this is a preferential looking task, where infants get to choose what they look at. And as we talked about with like habituation and these preferential looking tasks, infants have the ability, even at birth, to choose between these things. And what they'll do is they'll do studies like this with this kind of stimuli, except this is from an old grainy textbook, and so it's all pixelated. So that would be like a completely full gray area. That kind of pixelated box would be a full gray area. And what they do is say, okay, well, can you tell the difference, baby? Which do you prefer to look at? The one that has no contrast, just the gray color block, versus the lines. Now, if you've got poor acuity, at some point, the closer these lines get together, the more it looks like the gray box. And so infants are going to be able to tell the difference between the left image, the left pair, before they can tell the difference between the right pair. And again, this is really going to be choosing what to look at. So the one on the right for a very, very young baby may not look different at all. Like, you're showing me two gray squares. So I don't prefer to look at either one of them because they're two gray squares. Whereas the one on the left is black and white lines, those high contrast images that I care about, that I'm interested in, versus gray. And so they'll prefer to look at those lines. So again, newborn vision is really, really bad. And it's not till, 6 months that it's starting to get more adult-like. Not saying that they can see 20/20 yet, but there's adults that see 2200, and that's okay. But it's at about a year that we really are getting that full kind of the best vision, that 2050 to 2020, that we're really getting good images. To kind of demonstrate how bad infant vision is, there's a program called Tiny Eyes, which allows you to upload photos, and it approximates what different ages can see at different distances. So 24 inches is 2 feet, so that's pretty far away. And this is actually an image of a face. It is really hard to tell it's an image of a face. So at 2 feet away, newborn infants can't see that. By 4 weeks, you're starting to kind of make out the face. Now notice, what you can see best is that kind of the hairline versus where the face starts. Those outside edges are what you can see the best at this 4 weeks. You can kind of see starting to get the make out of where the eyes and the mouth would be. But what you can see best is that contrast by the outside of the face. By 8 weeks, it's starting to look a lot more face-like. At 3 months, you need glasses, but it's okay. And at 6 months, it's not perfect, but it's getting much, much better. So again, you can see how this ability to focus that lens, that accommodation, really changes dramatically in that first 6 months. And so this is the original image that I uploaded, and so you can see even that 6 month video, that 6 month picture, is not as crisp as the actual picture. So you can see kind of those differences. Now remember, when we were looking at that newborn picture and that 4-week-old picture, what we were seeing, the easiest things to see were those those high contrast images. And what we see is that that's because it kind of follows these rules for scanning. One of the reasons it's going to be easiest to tell the outside of things is infants, that's where they look, because that's where they can see the best. So at about when they're newborns, we see that they're really focusing on the outside of an image. So when shown this triangle, this is an eye tracking study, they see that the infant is paying a lot of attention to this point, these outside edges of this triangle. And so again, we're seeing at 2 weeks this kind of outside pattern. By 2 months, that really shifts. And by 12 weeks, we see scanning the entire image. So by 12 weeks, again, we're seeing kind of this internal scanning and that external scanning. So this really helps with kind of form perception. So we're not going to be able to necessarily tell the difference between parts and wholes really until later, till we can both scan the inside and the outside of objects. This is the same thing with the relationship between parts. We're not going to be able to really do that until much later because of this difference in scanning patterns and where infants are paying attention. So visual perception is affected by several things. Infants prefer certain visual attributes. Infants prefer curved shapes over straight shapes. They prefer symmetrical objects over asymmetrical objects. They prefer things that have verticality to them. That means that they're aligned in a vertical way. So think of a letter T that has verticality to it. It has symmetry to it. Whereas, let's say, If you turn that T on its side, you wouldn't have that verticality. Then we'd have kind of it going horizontal, right? So that verticality is something that infants prefer. Infants really like things that move. And what's really interesting is all of these preferences for curve, shape, symmetry, verticality, movement are all found in the thing that infants like to look at the most, the human face. So it has curved shapes. It's round. It has round shapes on it. It's symmetrical, right? So you can, kind of fold it down to half and it's pretty symmetrical. It has verticality. If you line up the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, that kind of makes that T shape that I was talking about. And it moves a lot. When it's talking, when it's smiling, when it's doing these things, it moves a lot. And so infants really, really pay attention to faces from the time that they're born. Now, whether that's because they prefer these things, they just happen to look at the face, or they look at faces so much that they prefer these things, that's a chicken or the egg question. But we know that infants prefer these things, and we know that they prefer faces, and we know that those things are correlated and those things are linked in some way. So newborns and 5-week-olds can discriminate pictures. Their live mother from another. So they can put, mom in front of them versus somebody else in front of them. And both newborns and 5-week-olds are going to prefer to look at their mother versus this other woman. And again, this is learned very, very rapidly and very, very early. If newborn infants can do this, this is telling you how rapidly this is being learned. So this graph here is the preference for the mother plotted against the number of active hours before contact of exposure, okay? So the more hours of exposure they had, that's what we have here, where it's 0 to 4. On the x-axis, we have where you're not having as much experience. We're not seeing as much of that preference. We have the preference score here, the percent preference for the mother, and you can see that positive correlation between them, right? So we see that as exposure goes up, so does preference. And so we see that these are learned really, really early, and that there is this positive correlation between them. Okay, so discrimination. Under 2 to 3 months, infants cannot discriminate faces when the hairlines are similar. So, because they're spending so much time scanning the outside of something, they're not going to be able to tell the difference between two people that have the same haircut. Even if it's mom with the same haircut versus somebody else with the same haircut, they're not going to be able to tell the difference. So they'll cover mom's head with a scarf or a wig and things like this, and they can't necessarily tell the difference. If you've ever seen a mom get a haircut in this range, especially if it's a drastic haircut, sometimes baby does not recognize mom anymore because there is this drastic change. Baby's not liking dad if he's wearing a hat. These are because of, again, they're scanning that outside pattern and they don't know who that person is when that outside pattern changes because they're using these external features to discriminate. But by 3 months, they can discriminate photos of a parent from a stranger even when those hairlines are similar. That's because of that shift in scanning patterns. They're starting to scan the inside of the face on those internal facial features to discriminate between two people. And when we say discriminate, we mean tell the difference between two things. We're not talking about in a social psychology term. Here in developmental psychology, especially in perception, when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about, can you tell the two things apart? Can you discriminate that they're separate, that they're different? So we have this preference for faces. We have this ability to learn faces really rapidly, both externally and then internally. And what we see is this experience with faces really tunes the perceptual system. And it allows it to focus on the kinds of faces it's going to see, the kinds of stimuli it's used to seeing. And we know this from several different kinds of studies. The first one we're going to talk about is other species studies. So at 6 months old, infants can discriminate between two different monkey faces. Monkey Johnny versus monkey Susie. They can tell the difference that those are two separate monkeys within that same species. But 9-month-olds and adults cannot do that. They cannot discriminate that these are different monkey faces. However, and this is because we don't see monkey faces. Do you spend a lot of time? If you spend a lot of time with monkeys, you'll still probably be able to do this. But if you don't spend a lot of time with monkeys, if you don't spend a lot of time looking at monkey faces, you're not going to be able to do that. And so what they did is they said, okay, well, 6-month-olds can do it, 9-month-olds can't. What if we give them exposure to monkey faces? What if we let them look at monkey faces every day or several times a week between 6 to 9 months? What will happen then? And what they found is when they were continually still exposed to those kinds of faces, that infants maintain that ability to discriminate. So again, this is evidence that that perceptual system is tuning itself to the stimuli that it's getting. So if you're a 6-month-old infant and you're not looking at monkey faces, then why keep that skill? What good does that do you? Why do you need that in your brain, right? That's not helping you out any. And so it's going to get rid of it. But if you are looking at monkey faces, your brain says, hey, this must be important. I might need to know how to discriminate between monkey faces. And so it keeps that. So again, this role of experience and the kinds of faces that infants are seeing really tunes the perceptual system into what they're going to need to function in their environment. We see the same thing with gender. So young infants more efficiently process and categorize female faces than male faces. 3-month-old infants prefer female faces. However, if they're reared by a male caregiver, they prefer male faces. This is that same experience thing. If you have a female caregiver, whose face are you looking at most? A female face. Who is likely to stop at you in the store and look at you in your stroller? A female. They're getting a lot more input from female faces. But again, if they have a male caregiver, if they have more experience with male faces, we don't see this. So again, we'll see that even the gender, even within our species, that the perceptual system is tuning to what it's seeing the most, to what it has the most experience with. We see this also with race. So when you hear about people not being able to discriminate between two individuals of a different ethnicity or a different race, this has to do with their limited experience with looking at faces of that other race. This is not some sort of outside explicit bias and racism or stereotyping. This is really this perceptual tuning of the face. Everyone agrees that babies are not born racist or discriminatory in terms of race or ethnicity. But we find these same patterns in infant face processing. So 3-month-olds, but not newborns, prefer their own race to other races. And that's if they're being reared by their biological parents that are of that same race. So this is that other race effect, that difficulty discriminating other race faces. And this really starts to emerge by 9 months of age. So at 3 months, they're already preferring to look at faces of the same race that they're used to looking at. That perceptual system is already starting to tune. But newborns don't. Newborns don't necessarily, hey, that's an interesting face, and hey, so's that. They don't prefer to look at one face versus the other because they don't have that same amount of input. If infants are really only being exposed to one race or one ethnicity, this is where that tuning starts to happen. And by 3 months, they're preferring that. And again, by 9 months, we're seeing that this difficulty discriminating other race faces emerges. Kelly and his colleagues tested Caucasian infants' discrimination of Caucasian, Chinese, Middle Eastern, and African faces. And at 3 months, they could discriminate in all conditions between two different people of, say, two different African faces or two different Middle Eastern faces. But by 6 months, they could only discriminate between Caucasian and Chinese faces. And by 9 months, they could only discriminate between their own race faces, the Caucasian faces. faces. So again, this is that tuning of the perceptual system. Now, if an infant is exposed to lots of faces of different races or repeatedly exposed, so if a baby is, say, biracial, or a baby has caregivers that are of a different race, we won't necessarily see that same narrowing because that information is still important. It's the perceptual system is saying, hey, I need to be able to tell the difference between all of these people. And so some studies have tried to look at where that line is and where that kind of happens. So the data suggests that really this broad, unspecified face processing system is at birth, okay? So it can tell the difference between genders, it can tell the difference between species, maybe monkey faces are important, I don't know, I just got here, I'm brand new, I'm a newborn. All different races, I don't know what I look like, I don't know what my face looks like, I don't know who my caregivers are, I need to be able to tell all those difference. But with experience that tunes down to really focusing on the kinds of faces that the infant sees the most, which is telling the system that these are the most important faces for you to be able to discriminate between. They've also done studies looking at age too. And even with adults, if you don't spend a lot of time looking at younger children and infants, adults have a hard time telling the difference between these faces. I remember being in a conference once and they were talking about this kind of age effect in face processing. And I was like, what do you mean they can't tell the difference between those two babies? Forgetting that I spent days and hours upon hours and stuff just staring at baby faces. Like that was my job for 5 years, actually more like 8 years, just looking at baby faces. So I got really good at being able to tell the difference between baby A and baby B, because that experience is important, that tuning to experience. This is really consistent with a lot of adult literature as well, this multidimensional face space model, which you don't need to get into the details of, but it's the idea that we kind of have this average idea of what a face is, what a quote unquote face is, and that at birth, that is a really broad, unspecified prototype, okay? Our example of what a face is a lot broader and a lot more all-encompassing. But as that input comes in, as different genders come in, as different races come in, as only one species comes in, it really affects that prototype and it becomes more and more like what they see. So if you think of every face as a data point and averaging that together, that would be kind of the prototype for that baby. So if baby's only seeing African American faces, then baby's prototype of what a face looks like is going to be African American. If baby's only seeing or primarily seeing female faces, then their idea of what a face looks like is going to be far more feminine than is going to be masculine. And again, this is that idea that is from the adult literature that we're really finding mirrored in this infant literature. Again, that speaks to replication. That speaks to this theory having a lot of evidence behind it. Okay, on to depth perception. So visual organization, again, we've talked about how that kind of organizes itself between 1 and 3 months, and then is really fully online by 6 to 12 months. But they have to be able to determine things around them, this perception of objects, when things has size constancy, depth perception. One of the ways they measure depth perception, and I know you covered this in your intro class, is the visual cliff. And so here's a picture of it. And so one side is very obviously solid, and it's checkerboard, it's very clearly solid. And the next side is not clearly solid because it's clear, it's plexiglass. And you can see that checkerboard pattern far, far below it. Now it's very solid and infants can crawl out on it and they'll be fine. And what we see is with this visual cliff, about 2 months that we're starting to detect depth cues, but we don't know that they're important yet. So they'll see that their heart rate will decelerate. They're noticing these differences in depth, but they don't know what to do with that. At 6 to 7 months, they start to really avoid this cliff. And it has to do with how much experience they have with crawling. and really how much experience they have with self-locomotion. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And by 9 months, they're really showing a fear response to this, and their heart rate accelerates when they were exposed to this cliff. And again, this has to do with how much experience, how much input they're getting into the perceptual system. So just like we talked about the development of prenatal senses of auditory and taste and smell and experience playing a role in that development, and then vision and face processing and experience playing a role in that development, we're seeing the exact same thing with depth perception. That experience plays a role in that development. So I'm going to say this frequently, but the better the input, the better the output. So the more information that the infant has to make decisions and to learn from and to organize this system, the better the output's going to be and the more quality that output's going to be. So I want you to, when you're done with this lecture, go and watch the Campos video. It's on the visual cliff, a moving room, and a mobility device. And it shows how they could actually speed up depth perception before crawling by giving infants the ability to self-locomote, by giving them kind of a little car they could drive. So watch that video. It really shows that it's not crawling that's doing it. It's really that ability to move yourself, to have a control over your own body that's doing it. There's also a video on gaps and walking that really talks about kind of that difference between movement. Okay. So our last slide, object perception. We know that infants use object boundaries and they're influenced by different things, okay? So we talked about high contrast being very, very important for newborns. But as they develop and as they come up with object perception, as they get more input, the other things that become important are background, texture, shape, pattern, and motion. And motion is really, really salient very, very early on in development. So what we see is Kelman and Spelke did a very famous study. It's called the moving rod study. And what they found is that 4-month-olds, but not newborns or 2-month-olds, perceived a moving rod as a unitary object. So here's an example of kind of what that looked like. And I'm sorry, this isn't the last slide. We have one more. But so they saw a video like this where a rod is moving behind a screen. And you and I would say, well, that's one rod, right? It's just a rod moving behind a screen. And then what they did is they tested infants with either a picture of a rod or a picture of two separate things. And they still had them moving. So they were habituated to A, and we all are familiar what habituated was because we all paid attention in class. And then they were tested with either B or C. And what they found was those 4-month-olds dishabituated to C because, like, that's crazy. That's not what I was just watching. But they didn't dishabituate to B because that is what I was just watching. It's just the screen's not there anymore. Whereas the 2-month-olds and the newborns didn't significantly show any difference between B and C. So again, this indicates that motion is really, really important in infants' perception of objects. And we see that in that face processing as well. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. Thanks so much.